November 22, 2003. A young woman leaves work at a mall in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. She's talking on the phone with her boyfriend just a few minutes from home. But something unexpected happens, and she vanishes, without a trace. Her disappearance would set off a chain of events that would leave an entire town shattered, and ultimately reveal a darker story than anyone could imagine. What if the last conversation you had with someone you loved ended abruptly, never to be heard from again? A quiet evening in Grand Forks, North Dakota. The Columbia Mall parking lot is dimly lit, empty save for a few scattered cars. The calm is almost eerie, the kind of stillness you only get when everyone else is inside, finishing up their holiday shopping. But out there, in that quiet parking lot, Dru Sjodin was finishing a day that should have been like any other. 22 years old, a senior at the University of North Dakota, Dru had just wrapped up her shift at Victoria's Secret. She was eager to head home, but before she left, she made a quick stop to pick up a purse from a nearby store. It was a small errand, a routine part of the evening, but Dru wasn't rushing. She had time. And as she headed towards her car, tucked away a few spaces from the entrance, she dialed her boyfriend Chris Lang to chat for a moment before going home. The night air was cold, but Dru seemed relaxed. She laughed as she spoke with Chris, her voice filled with the kind of ease you get when you're speaking to someone you know well. The conversation was light, nothing out of the ordinary, just a couple of young people exchanging pleasantries. As she approached her car, Dru said, "Okay." The words were cut off just like that, silence. The call dropped and the line went dead. But Dru didn't realize it yet. In that brief moment of silence, something had shifted. No one would hear from Dru again that night, but Dru would speak no more, and get some attention in the process. For Chris Lang, it probably didn't seem like much. Just another dropped call, a minor inconvenience. But for Dru, the phone had gone silent for a reason, and what seemed like an everyday disconnection was, in fact, the beginning of a nightmare. The phone crackled into silence. Chris Lang jumped out of his car and came around. He put down his phone. The clock ticked on, but Dru didn't make it home. Her car remained parked in the lot, untouched, its door still locked. No one would know where she had gone or what had happened to her, at least not yet. But that night, the quiet town of Grand Forks was about to be thrust into a mystery no one could have predicted. What seemed like an ordinary night for Dru turned into something unimaginable. No one knew it yet, but as soon as that phone call ended, a chain of events was set in motion that would change everything. Imagine being the last person to speak to someone before they disappear. How would you feel if you realized a phone call had been the last contact you had with a loved one? Would you think it was nothing? Or would you immediately sense that something was terribly wrong? Let me know in the comments, what do you think happened after Dru's phone call was cut short? Sjodin was more than just a name. She was a force of nature, a bright, ambitious young woman with a future full of possibility. Born on September 26, 1981 in Crookston, Minnesota, Dru was the kind of person who made a lasting impact on everyone she met. From a young age, she was always surrounded by love and support from her family, her friends, and her community. As a child, Dru's smile was infectious. She was always the first to lend a hand, the one who took charge when there was work to be done, and the one who made everything a little brighter. Her parents, her siblings, and anyone who had the privilege of knowing her could tell you, Dru was destined for great things. Growing up in the small town of Crookston, Dru's life was full of family gatherings and community events. She was always there, ready to share a laugh or lend a helping hand. Whether she was helping her mom in the kitchen or playing outside with her siblings, Dru was known for her kind heart and her ability to bring people together. In high school, Dru blossomed into the ambitious young woman who would later pursue a degree in graphic arts. It was no surprise when she graduated with high honors, ready to take on the world. Her friends remember her as someone who wasn't just a student, but a force of positivity, a woman who always made you feel like you could achieve anything you set your mind to. Time Dru was a senior at the University of North Dakota, she had become the embodiment of promise. She was studying graphic arts, a field she had always dreamed of working in, determined to create a life for herself filled with creativity and purpose. Her professors and classmates alike admired her for her drive, her work ethic, and her genuine, down-to-earth nature. Dru was the kind of person who made everyone feel at ease, who brought a lightness to even the toughest assignments. And in the midst of her college career, Dru found love. She met Chris Lang, a fellow student, and the two quickly became inseparable. To Chris, Dru wasn't just a girlfriend. She was his partner, his best friend, and the person who always knew how to make him laugh, even on the hardest days. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding that they were meant to be together. Her family saw Dru as the glue that held everything together. She was the one who kept in touch with everyone, who made sure everyone felt important. Whether it was her mom, her dad, or her siblings, Dru was there for them. Her love was unconditional, and she gave all of herself to those she cared about. Her mother remembers how, even as a child, Dru was always thinking of others. She wasn't the type to make a fuss over herself. It was always about helping her family and friends, about making life better for those around her. That giving nature stayed with her all the way through adulthood. Even in college, Dru was known for her kindness and willingness to help anyone in need. Dru wasn't just a student. She was a young woman on the verge of something incredible. She was poised to make an impact in the world of graphic design, to take the skills she had honed through years of hard work and passion, and use them to create a career that was uniquely hers. Her light was only getting brighter, her dreams bigger, but it was that same light, her energy, her joy, and the love she gave, that made her disappearance all the more unimaginable. Dru was a woman who had everything ahead of her, but on that night, her life was stolen from her too soon, leaving her family, her friends, and everyone who knew her heartbroken and wondering, how could this happen to someone like Dru? Dru's life was one of light and promise. Do you remember someone who had that same energy? Someone who made everything better just by being there? Someone who seemed like they could do anything they set their mind to? What happens when someone like that is taken from the world too soon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As the hours ticked by after Dru's phone call was abruptly cut off, the worry that had slowly started to creep into the hearts of her family and friends began to grow into something far more serious. Dru was a responsible young woman. She wouldn't just disappear without a word. Her mother, father, and boyfriend, Chris Lang, tried calling her again and again, but each attempt went unanswered. Chris, immediately concerned, was the first to report Dru missing. The sense of urgency in his voice echoed the growing fear that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't like Dru to leave without saying where she was going. She had plans for the evening and had been excited to meet with friends later that night. Investigators quickly sprang into action, determined to find any clues that could explain Dru's sudden disappearance. Surveillance footage from the Columbia Mall offered the first lead. The footage showed Dru walking toward her car in the parking lot, chatting with her boyfriend. But as the video played on, there was something missing. There was no sign of a man, no indication that someone else was involved. At first glance, it seemed like a routine evening. But something invisible was about to shatter that illusion. Peter began to assess the landscape around him, preparing to move out. It seemed necessary to consider what he was doing regardless. As authorities expanded their search, it became clear that this wasn't just a missing person case. It was a mystery, The search area stretched across state lines, from North Dakota to Minnesota. Authorities, with the help of family and friends, began scouring the area, knocking on doors and questioning anyone who might have seen something. But as the days passed, there were still no answers. The more they searched, the more questions seemed to arise. The town of Grand Forks and surrounding areas came together in a way that only tragedy can inspire. Volunteers, neighbors, and Dru's friends and family members rallied, organizing search parties and handing out missing person flyers. People searched tirelessly, covering forests, fields, and roads, hoping for any sign of Dru. Local news outlets reported on the case, spreading the word of Dru's disappearance far and wide. The news stirred up fear in the community. After all, this wasn't a city where people locked their doors at night. Grand Forks, a place where everyone knew each other, felt like a safe haven. Now, Dru's disappearance had shattered that sense of security. There was an unsettling truth: someone had taken her, and they were still out there. Law enforcement had a rough start, with little to go on. There were no eyewitnesses, no clear evidence pointing to a suspect, and no immediate clues as to who had taken Dru. The only lead was her car, found locked and abandoned in the parking lot of the Columbia Mall. Search teams combed every inch of the area, from rivers to wooded parks, following every tip and every piece of evidence. They turned over stones, checked abandoned houses, and even searched dumpsters, in hopes of finding something, anything, that would explain Dru's disappearance. Meanwhile, Dru's family, still reeling from the shock, spoke publicly for the first time, urging anyone with information to come forward. Their hearts ached as they pleaded with the community, their voices trembling as they asked, "Where is Dru?" They had no answers, no closure, just an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Dru intensified. More volunteers joined the effort, including the use of helicopters and search dogs, but still there were no answers. The hope of finding Dru alive began to fade with each passing day. Imagine being in the shoes of Dru's family and friends. How would you feel after days of searching and still having no answers? Would you be able to hold on to hope, or would the unknown be too much to bear? As the investigation into Dru's disappearance entered its third week, the exhaustion and frustration began to set in. Investigators had followed every possible lead, spoken to countless witnesses, and tracked down tips from the community, but nothing seemed to bring them closer to finding Dru, or understanding who was responsible for her disappearance. With every passing day, hope was slipping away. The authorities could only do so much, pursuing dead ends, chasing down tips, and scanning through countless hours of surveillance footage. But every piece of evidence seemed to raise more questions than answers. The town of Grand Forks, once a peaceful and tight-knit community, was now gripped by fear. The public's desire for answers grew, but with each passing day, the mystery deepened. Where was Dru? As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the search for Dru continued, but no solid leads came through. While the community rallied behind the Sjodin family, volunteering for searches and spreading awareness, there was still one missing link. Investigators were growing desperate. They were beginning to feel as if they were chasing shadows. Local news stations kept the story alive, but as weeks passed without a breakthrough, the media coverage began to turn from hope to speculation. Rumors swirled, and the growing uncertainty about the case started to take its toll on everyone involved. People began to wonder if the police were getting closer to the truth, or if they were running out of options. It wasn't long before law enforcement reached out for help. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing in additional resources, manpower, and expertise. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of Dru's last moments, retracing her steps with painstaking detail. But with no clear suspect, the police began to feel the pressure mounting. One of the first major breakthroughs came from the surveillance footage at Columbia Mall. The grainy images didn't reveal much, but there was one key piece: a figure in the background, walking toward Dru's car. The figure was barely noticeable, but it was there. Was this person the one who had taken Dru? It was the first real lead. The problem was, the face was too blurry to make out, and the figure wasn't the only person seen in the parking lot that night. The search expanded. With no definitive leads in Grand Forks, the investigation spread to surrounding states. The authorities were desperate to find any connection, any link that could finally point them to Dru's whereabouts. But as each day passed, the weight of uncertainty loomed larger. The police needed something, anything, that would allow them to take the next step. Then, months into the investigation, a chilling development surfaced. A connection between Dru's disappearance and a man with a long and dark criminal past. At first, it was just a name, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. But authorities were cautious. They didn't have enough to connect him to the case yet. They didn't even know how dangerous he truly was. But one thing was clear. Rodriguez had a history. The name was familiar to the police. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a man with a record, one that included multiple sexual assaults and an attempted kidnapping. His name had surfaced before, but no one knew the full extent of his criminal activities. Rodriguez's past was deeply troubling, and as investigators dug deeper into his history, they realized just how dangerous he was. He had been convicted of crimes that left victims scarred for life, and now he was the focal point of the investigation. But was he Dru's abductor? Rodriguez's name was now at the center of the investigation, yet there was still no clear connection to Dru's case. There were no eyewitnesses, no DNA evidence, at least, not yet. But as authorities continued to dig into Rodriguez's movements around the time of Dru's disappearance, something even more chilling began to emerge. What would you do if you were a police officer working on this case? How would you handle the pressure of such a high-profile, unsolved disappearance? The investigation eventually led to a chilling discovery. The man suspected of being involved in Dru's disappearance was no stranger to the justice system. His name was Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a man with a deeply troubling history. Born in 1953, Rodriguez was the son of migrant workers who had moved between Texas and Minnesota. As a young man, Rodriguez was involved in multiple violent crimes. His first serious offense occurred when he was just 21 during an attempted sexual assault. That was just the beginning of a long and disturbing criminal record. Rodriguez's criminal path was not one he had stumbled upon by accident. From a young age, he had shown a pattern of violent and deviant behavior. His first major offense occurred when he was just 21 years old, a failed attempt to abduct and sexually assault a woman at knife point. This marked the beginning of a criminal career that would span over 3 decades. Over time, Rodriguez's crimes grew more brutal and dangerous, eventually leading to multiple convictions for rape, kidnapping, and assault. In the 1970s and 1980s, Rodriguez spent several years in prison after being convicted for the brutal assault of a woman. Yet, in 2003, after serving 23 years for a previous crime, Rodriguez was released back into society. Despite his lengthy criminal record, he was deemed a Level 3 sex offender, classified as a high risk for reoffending. His release was a part of Minnesota's legal system, which allowed high-risk offenders to re-enter the community after serving their sentences. But to many, this was a dangerous oversight, and they would soon find out just how disastrous that decision would become. Rodriguez's release in May 2003 should have been a red flag. A man with his violent background, especially one who had shown a pattern of escalating offenses, should have been under more scrutiny. But instead, he was living quietly in Crookston, Minnesota, trying to keep a low profile. and no one could have predicted the horror that would soon unfold. Rodriguez's past wasn't the only thing that made him dangerous. His behavior was erratic, and investigators soon learned that he had a tendency to fixate on women. Neighbors recalled how he kept to himself, often staying inside, but there were whispers of strange behaviors. Still, no one suspected that this man, who had been living so quietly in his mother's house, was capable of the horrific crime that had shocked the entire community of Grand Forks. As the investigation began to focus on Rodriguez, law enforcement uncovered startling evidence linking him to Dru's disappearance. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place: his movements near the mall on the day Dru went missing, his criminal history, and the disturbing purchases he had made. But there was one key detail. No one could have predicted just how deeply this man's past would influence the outcome. As the lead author of the case offers, Dr. Dennis Kroger enters the jury box to discuss the outcome of the battle over the case. When you hear about someone's past, does it change your perception of them completely? How much weight should a person's criminal history carry in determining their future actions? Rodriguez's criminal history was extensive, and it didn't take long for authorities to piece together the events that led to Dru's abduction. Surveillance footage showed a man matching his description near the mall the night she vanished. A few key pieces of evidence, seemingly innocuous at first, would prove to be the key to unlocking this horrifying mystery. It was only after a painstaking review of security footage that investigators began to connect the dots. A man was seen lurking near Dru's car just moments before she disappeared. The figure was initially unremarkable, blending into the crowd. But after a deeper look, investigators began to suspect that this was no random bystander. The footage showed him moving deliberately, watching Dru as she walked to her car, and then disappearing into the shadows, right before she vanished without a trace. At first, the investigators couldn't be sure. But a man matching Rodriguez's description was seen walking near the mall just before Dru's last phone call was abruptly cut off. Then came the breakthrough. A receipt from a nearby store for a knife, a tool that seemed oddly familiar. The police had found the same kind of knife in Rodriguez's car, one that matched the evidence collected at the scene. The purchase of the knife seemed like a small detail, but it would soon prove to be crucial. Investigators knew they had to act quickly, but the final nail in the coffin came when it was revealed that Rodriguez's alibi was full of holes. The report gave Klein a long list of bad deeds committed during his time in prison for rape. Rodriguez had claimed that he had been watching a movie at the mall cinema that night, but investigators quickly debunked that alibi. Not only had the movie he claimed to watch not been playing at the time, but there were no records to suggest he had been at the theater at all. His story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Flashnegoski, with mounting evidence pointing squarely at him, Rodriguez's capture became inevitable. It wasn't long before the arrest team was mobilized. On March 4, 2004, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was arrested in connection to Dru's disappearance. The handcuffs snapped into place, and with them, the hopes of Dru's family that the man responsible for her abduction would finally face justice. Rodriguez was finally in custody, but the weight of his actions was still far from clear. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details about his previous crimes and connections to Dru's case began to surface. But for Dru's family, this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. For Dru's family, the arrest brought a sense of relief, but it also marked the start of an agonizing process. Would justice be served? Would they get the answers they so desperately needed? And most importantly, would Dru's memory finally be honored? Sometimes did. Dru would take his helmet and personally call out as he was boarded. Only once. What emotions do you think a suspect feels when they know they're about to be caught? And how does it feel for those who've been waiting for the truth, knowing that it's finally within reach? The discovery of Dru's body was both devastating and heartbreaking. After months of tireless searching by law enforcement, volunteers, and Dru's family, her remains were finally found in a ravine just outside Crookston, Minnesota. The search had stretched on through the cold winter months, and as spring began to take hold in April 2004, the snow began to melt, revealing what no one had hoped they would find. It was April when the long-awaited discovery was made. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the harsh reality that had been buried for months. At the edge of the ravine, hidden beneath layers of snow, Dru's body was uncovered. The moment the investigators laid eyes on her remains, they knew the truth. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a brutal and calculated act. The horror of what Dru had suffered was evident. Her body had been subjected to unspeakable violence, beaten, stabbed, and sexually assaulted. Her hands were bound, and there were clear signs of trauma. It was clear she had been murdered in cold blood. This wasn't just a kidnapping gone wrong. This was a deliberate act of violence, an end to a young life filled with promise. For Dru's parents, the fight for justice wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about honoring their daughter's memory. No sentence could bring Dru back, but her parents remained determined to ensure her story lived on, serving as a reminder of the need for justice, safety, and reform. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Crookston, a small and tight-knit town, had been forever changed. For months, they had hoped and prayed for Dru's safe return. Now that hope had been crushed, and the sense of loss was palpable. The town rallied together to support Dru's family in their darkest hour, but the reality of the brutal crime that had unfolded in their midst began to settle in. As Dru's family grieved, the search for justice continued. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became a call to action, a plea for answers that reverberated across the nation. Her memory became a symbol of the fight for justice, for safety, and for the need to prevent such horrors from happening to others. Dru's life had been full of potential, a future that was violently interrupted. In the wake of her death, questions remained unanswered. Who could have committed such a heinous act? What could have driven a person to take a young woman's life in such a savage and senseless way? How do you think a community copes with the discovery of something so tragic? What is the emotional impact of finally knowing the truth about what happened to someone you loved? And then there's grief. And now it's time to lay out. The wheels of justice began to turn as Rodriguez faced trial for his role in Dru's brutal murder. The courtroom, which had become a battleground for justice, was filled with tension. Dru's family and friends, who had waited for years for answers, now had to endure a trial that would ultimately decide the fate of the man responsible for her death. In 2006, after a lengthy and emotionally charged trial, Rodriguez was found guilty of kidnapping, murder, and other related charges. His conviction was a hard-won victory for Dru's family, but the journey toward justice was far from over. The judge sentenced Rodriguez to death, a decision that sparked widespread debate over the use of the death penalty in the United States. For many, the death penalty seemed like the only fitting punishment for the brutal crime Rodriguez had committed. Dru's family, who had been through unimaginable pain, now sought closure and justice in the most severe way possible. But as time passed, questions began to emerge about the fairness of the sentencing. In 2021, a turn of events shocked both the public and Dru's family. A judge, Ralph Erickson, who had previously sentenced Rodriguez to death, reversed the decision due to controversial testimony during the trial. Testimony from the Ramsey County medical examiner had been called into question, with the judge citing it as unreliable and misleading. Furthermore, Rodriguez's defense team had been criticized for limiting his mental health evaluation, which could have potentially opened the door to an insanity defense. The legal battle was far from over. As the case was revisited, the death sentence was replaced with a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2023, this final sentence was handed down, marking the end of the legal proceedings. But for Dru's family, the pain of losing their daughter would never truly end. Dru's family, who had fought tirelessly for justice, now faced the reality that their journey for closure was not as simple as they had hoped. While they had achieved a legal victory, the emotional scars remained. In the end, the sentencing brought finality, but it didn't undo the horror Dru had experienced, or the pain that her family would carry with them forever. The case became a focal point in the ongoing debate about the death penalty. While some saw the life sentence as a fair resolution, others felt it didn't measure up to the brutality of the crime. The public's reaction was divided. No consensus seemed to exist about what justice truly looked like in this case. For Dru's parents, the fight for justice wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about honoring their daughter's memory. No sentence could bring Dru back, but her parents remained determined to ensure her story lived on, serving as a reminder of the need for justice, safety, and reform. In the wake of Dru's tragic death, the fight for justice did not end with the sentencing of Alfonso Rodriguez. Her family, devastated by the loss, took her memory and turned it into a powerful force for change. The pain of losing a loved one in such horrific circumstances ignited a movement that would resonate across the country. Dru's family, along with her friends and countless supporters, organized memorials, candlelight vigils, and community events to ensure her legacy would live on. Each year, people gathered to remember a young woman who had been full of promise, whose life was taken too soon. But in the face of such overwhelming grief, they did not just mourn, they acted. Dru's case sparked nationwide conversations about the safety of women, the accountability of sex offenders, and the flaws in the justice system. In 2005, just 2 years after Dru's death, a monumental piece of legislation was passed, the Dru Sjodin National Sex Offender Public Registry. In the years since Dru's death, her family has worked tirelessly to raise awareness and create change. The Dru Sjodin Memorial Fund continues to support victims of sexual violence, providing resources for counseling, legal assistance, and advocacy. The foundation ensures that Dru's legacy remains one of hope and healing, even as her absence leaves a hole in the hearts of those who knew her. Dru Sjodin's legacy is not defined by her tragic end, but by the impact she continues to have on the world. Her memory lives on in the laws that protect the vulnerable, in the lives that have been saved because of her family's fight, and in the hearts of those who continue to work towards a future free of violence. Dru's story may have ended tragically, but her legacy lives on through the changes she helped bring to the world. Her memory reminds us all of the importance of justice, the fight for victims' rights, and the need to stand together as a community. Share this story. Keep Dru's memory alive. And don't forget, justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It starts with all of us, making the world a safer place. What can we all do to ensure that stories like Dru's do not fade into the past? Let's keep her story alive, together.
Don't forget to like, subscribe for more interest episodes. Thanks very much for watching today's episode. See you in my next story.